Mr. James Carter, an elderly black man in his early 70s, had lived in the same neighborhood for most of his life. Known for his calm demeanor and old-school sense of dignity, he was well-liked by everyone who truly knew him. Today, however, Mr. Carter was walking into the local bank for a simple reason. He needed to withdraw some money. It was supposed to be a normal visit, the kind of errand he'd done countless times over the years. He had been banking here for decades, and the staff knew him by name. But today, things felt different. The moment Mr. Carter walked through the doors, he noticed the young teller behind the counter, a woman he hadn't seen before. She was busy typing away at her computer, not paying much attention to him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his age, but still trying to remain cheerful. He walked up to the counter and smiled, waiting for her to notice him. When she finally looked up, there was no smile, no welcoming greeting. Instead, the teller seemed distracted, as though Mr. Carter's presence was an inconvenience. She didn't ask him what he needed or how she could help him. Instead, she simply stared at his ID, clearly uninterested in the transaction he was about to make. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, as if she was just going through the motions. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," Mr. Carter said politely, handing over his account details. The teller didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the computer screen for a few seconds, clicking away at the keys. Mr. Carter waited patiently, but the silence between them was thick. It felt wrong, like something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Mr. Carter," she said finally, looking up at him, "I'm afraid there's a problem with your account." The words caught Mr. Carter off guard. "A problem?" he repeated. "What kind of problem?" She barely glanced at him before saying, "It's under review. You'll need to come back later." Mr. Carter was confused. He had never experienced any issues with his account before, and the way the teller spoke made him feel as though he was somehow the problem. "Under review?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "I've been banking here for years. Surely this can be resolved quickly." The teller didn't seem to care. "I'm sorry, sir. There's nothing I can do for you today." Mr. Carter's heart sank. Something wasn't right. It was as if he was being dismissed, not as a loyal customer of decades, but as someone insignificant. He glanced around the bank, hoping someone else would step in to help, but the other employees were busy and didn't seem to notice the tension building at the counter. Frustrated, Mr. Carter asked, "Can I speak to your manager, please?" The teller looked irritated at the request, but reluctantly, she turned around to find the manager. Moments later, Ms. Riley, the branch manager, appeared. She walked up with a stiff, almost robotic smile, and Mr. Carter could already sense that this was not going to be an easy conversation. "How may I help you?" Ms. Riley asked, her tone barely masking her impatience. "I'd like to understand what's going on with my account," Mr. Carter said, his voice steady, though a part of him was starting to feel uneasy. Ms. Riley's eyes flickered to the screen in front of the teller, and without asking Mr. Carter anything further, she said, "You'll need to come back another time. There's nothing I can do for you now." Mr. Carter was taken aback. He had expected a bit more courtesy, more understanding, especially given his long history with the bank. But instead, he was being turned away without explanation. Something didn't feel right at all. Mr. Carter stood still for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He'd always prided himself on his calm and patient nature, but today was different. He had been treated as if he wasn't worthy of their time. The way the teller dismissed him, and the manager's cold response made his heart feel heavy. "I don't understand," Mr. Carter said, his voice steady but laced with confusion. "I've been banking here for years. You've never had any problems with my account before." Ms. Riley looked at him for a second before speaking in a tone that seemed more dismissive than reassuring. "I'm sorry, but it's beyond my control. The system says your account is under review, and I can't do anything about it." Mr. Carter felt his patience thinning. He wasn't used to being treated this way, especially after all the years of loyalty to the bank. He could feel his temper rising, but he knew he had to remain composed. His next words were carefully chosen, though his frustration was starting to show. "I'd like to speak to someone higher up, please. Maybe someone who can actually help me." Ms. Riley hesitated for a moment, clearly not pleased by the request. "I'll have to call security if you keep insisting," she said, her voice growing sharper. Mr. Carter, though taken aback, refused to let the situation get the best of him. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to complete my transaction, like I always do." Without saying another word, Ms. Riley turned away, walking briskly toward a small office behind the counter. Mr. Carter could feel the eyes of the other employees on him, but none of them seemed willing to step in or offer help. They went on with their work as if nothing was out of the ordinary, ignoring the uncomfortable scene unfolding at the front of the bank. Minutes passed before Ms. Riley returned, flanked by a security guard. The guard, a tall man with a stern face, looked at Mr. Carter as though he was some kind of threat. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his tone businesslike but not welcoming. Mr. Carter stood up straighter, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I just want to complete my transaction," he said. "I've asked for help, but no one seems willing to listen." The guard's gaze shifted between Mr. Carter and the manager. He didn't seem to understand why a simple transaction was causing so much trouble. Still, he didn't question the manager's instructions. "Sir," the guard said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave if you don't stop causing a scene." Mr. Carter felt a surge of anger, but he remained calm. He wasn't there to start a fight. "I'm not causing a scene. I'm simply asking for help. Please leave the premises," the guard repeated, his voice more forceful now. Mr. Carter, now feeling the weight of the situation, glanced around at the other customers. No one was stepping forward to help him. No one was coming to his defense. He felt like a stranger in a place that had once been a second home. Reluctantly, Mr. Carter stood up. "I'll leave," he said, though it was clear that this wasn't how he wanted things to end. "But I'll be back. You haven't heard the last of this." As Mr. Carter made his way toward the door, he overheard some of the bank employees gossiping among themselves. He caught a few words: "Old man," "troublemaker," and "probably doesn't have enough money," their voices barely above a whisper but still loud enough for him to hear. The sting of their words hit him harder than he expected, but he held his head high. He wasn't going to let their ignorance break him. Little did the bank employees know, Mr. Carter wasn't just an ordinary customer. He had a few things up his sleeve that they were about to learn the hard way. Mr. Carter stood outside the bank, feeling the cool breeze against his face. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. It wasn't just the rudeness of the staff that upset him. It was the way they had treated him. As though he didn't matter. As though his years of loyalty to the bank meant nothing. But he wasn't one to back down, not without a fight. He pulled out his phone and dialed the bank's corporate number. He had no idea how this would turn out, but he wasn't going to let them get away with what they'd done. The phone rang for a few moments before someone on the other end picked up. "Good afternoon, this is Claire from customer service. How can I assist you?" the voice on the phone said politely. Mr. Carter, still upset, cleared his throat. "Hello, Claire. My name is James Carter, and I just had an unpleasant experience at your branch on Fifth Avenue. I need to speak with someone who can help me resolve this." There was a slight pause before Claire spoke again. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Carter. What seems to be the issue?" Mr. Carter explained what had happened, the dismissive teller, the cold treatment from the manager, and how he had been escorted out by security. He also mentioned the rude comments he had overheard from some of the employees. "I've been a customer here for decades," Mr. Carter continued, "and I've never been treated like this before. I'm not sure what's going on, but I expect to be treated with respect." Claire was silent for a moment. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Carter. That's certainly not the level of service we aim to provide. I'll escalate this issue to the branch's regional manager immediately." Mr. Carter thanked her, But deep down, he knew he needed to do more. He wasn't going to let this go so easily. He needed to take action, not just for himself, but for anyone who had been treated unfairly by this branch. The next morning, Mr. Carter was back at the bank, determined to get answers. He had made sure to wear his best suit, knowing that appearance could often make all the difference. He wasn't going to let them think he was just another old man who could be pushed aside. As he entered the bank, he could feel the eyes of the employees on him. They were probably wondering why he was back after yesterday's scene. But Mr. Carter had no intention of making a scene. He was here for one thing: an explanation. He walked up to the same teller who had treated him so poorly the day before. She looked surprised to see him, but quickly composed herself. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her tone still polite but lacking warmth. "I need to speak with your manager again," Mr. Carter said firmly. This time, there was no hesitation. The teller went to the back and returned with Ms. Riley, the same manager who had dismissed him the day before. But today, there was something different about her. She wasn't acting as coldly as she had before. Perhaps she had been told about the complaint. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for the inconvenience yesterday," Ms. Riley said, her tone more formal now. "I understand that you're upset, but we have procedures to follow." Mr. Carter could tell she was trying to cover up her earlier behavior, but he wasn't buying it. "I understand procedures," he said, his voice steady. "But I also understand respect, and I didn't get any of that from you or your staff." Ms. Riley seemed to shift uncomfortably, but she quickly recovered. "I can assure you that this matter will be addressed," she said. "We've had some issues with account reviews, but I'll make sure yours is cleared up as soon as possible." Mr. Carter nodded. He wasn't going to let it end here. He was going to hold them accountable, no matter how long it took. The following days were filled with silence. Mr. Carter's patience was starting to wear thin as he waited for an update from the bank. He had returned to the branch several times, hoping to see a change in how he was treated, but each time, it felt like nothing had improved. It was as if the incident was being brushed aside. But then, one morning, things took an unexpected turn. Mr. Carter arrived at the bank, dressed in his usual dark suit, looking every bit the successful man he was. He'd learned long ago that sometimes appearing confident was half the battle. As he walked in, he noticed the same teller behind the counter, but today she looked uneasy when she saw him. She seemed to be waiting for something. He approached the counter and smiled, trying to keep things light. "Good morning," he said, placing his account details in front of her. The teller nodded, but didn't respond. Her eyes flickered nervously to Ms. Riley, who had appeared in the back office. But instead of approaching Mr. Carter, the manager quickly retreated into the back. The uncomfortable tension hung in the air. Something was off, but Mr. Carter couldn't put his finger on it. He waited patiently, hoping someone would come to help him. A few moments later, one of the other bank employees, a young man with a nervous look on his face, approached Mr. Carter. He glanced around before speaking in a hushed voice. "Mr. Carter, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The request shocked him. "Excuse me?" Mr. Carter asked, his voice calm but with a clear note of disbelief. "What do you mean, ask me to leave?" The young man lowered his voice further. "We've been told to escort you off the premises. It's just company policy." Before Mr. Carter could respond, the same security guard from earlier appeared at the entrance, his large frame blocking the door. The guard looked at Mr. Carter with a cold stare, giving the impression that he was ready to take action if necessary. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the bank," the security guard said firmly, crossing his arms over his chest. Mr. Carter's mind raced. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being asked to leave. The guard didn't even seem to care to hear his side of the story. "I'm not going anywhere," Mr. Carter replied, his voice firm now. "This is my bank, and I'm not leaving until I speak to someone who can explain why I've been treated like this." The security guard's face hardened. "You're causing a scene. If you don't leave now, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities." Mr. Carter could feel his frustration bubbling up, but he held himself in check. He wasn't about to let them intimidate him. He wasn't some troublemaker, but today he had had enough. As he prepared to stand his ground, he overheard something from the back office. It was a voice he recognized. "Let him be," said a calm, authoritative voice that carried through the bank. "I'll handle this." Mr. Carter turned around in surprise. It was Claire from customer service, the same person he had spoken to on the phone. She walked towards him, her expression serious but determined. "I've heard what's been going on," Claire said, her voice calm but firm. "And I'm not going to let you be treated like this anymore." For a moment, there was silence in the bank. The security guard hesitated, and the employees exchanged uncertain looks. They all seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. Claire turned to the bank manager, Ms. Riley, who had just emerged from the back. "This man is one of our top investors," Claire said, her voice steady. "And I'll be making sure that his concerns are taken seriously, immediately." Ms. Riley's face turned pale. I didn't know." Claire didn't wait for her to finish. "No more excuses. We're fixing this." The atmosphere shifted. The tension in the bank began to dissolve as the staff started to understand who Mr. Carter really was. The moment he was given the respect he deserved, things seemed to change for the better. As the minutes passed, Mr. Carter's mind raced. He had stood firm in the face of adversity, but now that things were starting to change, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. It had been a long time since he had to fight for something, and this felt different, personal, even. Claire, the customer service representative who had spoken up for him, walked up to Mr. Carter with a sense of urgency. She motioned for him to follow her to a quiet corner of the bank where they could talk without being overheard. "Mr. Carter, I'm terribly sorry for what's happened," Claire said, her face sincere. "I had no idea about the way you were treated here. I'll make sure this is addressed properly. But there's something you should know." Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Claire hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You see, Mr. Carter, we've been unaware of your full involvement with this bank. I didn't recognize your name when you came in, but after we checked, we discovered you are one of our most important investors. You've helped keep this bank running for years. Your shares, they're a significant part of our success." The words hit Mr. Carter like a surprise. He had kept his investments largely private, preferring to stay out of the public eye and let his business run quietly in the background. He didn't like making a spectacle of himself, but hearing Claire's words made him realize just how much power he truly held. "I didn't think it was necessary to let anyone know," Mr. Carter said quietly, his voice steady despite the shock he felt. "I've never been one for attention." Claire nodded. "I understand. But I think it's time for everyone here to understand that you're not just any customer. You've been a major force behind this bank's success for years." It all began to click for Mr. Carter. The dismissiveness, the cold treatment, they hadn't been caused by a misunderstanding or a mistake. They had been because of something far more troubling: bias. The bank staff had not bothered to recognize him or show him the respect he deserved because of his age and race. "I never wanted anyone to treat me differently because of my investments," Mr. Carter said thoughtfully. "But I see now that perhaps I should have made my role more known." Claire looked at him with understanding. "I think we can fix this. It's time to make sure everyone understands the truth, and we'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Just then, the bank manager, Ms. Riley, stepped over to where they were talking. Her face had softened, and there was a noticeable change in her attitude. She didn't seem as defensive as before. "I want to personally apologize for the way you've been treated," Ms. Riley said, her voice genuine but slightly nervous. "I had no idea who you were, Mr. Carter. If I had known, things would have been handled differently." Mr. Carter looked at her, sensing the sincerity in her words. "It's not just about knowing who I am. It's about treating people with respect, no matter who they are." Ms. Riley nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right. I've learned a valuable lesson here, and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. We'll provide more training for our staff and make sure they understand that every customer, no matter their background, deserves to be treated with dignity." Mr. Carter appreciated her words, but he also knew that actions spoke louder than words. He wanted to see real change, not just promises. "Let's start fresh," Mr. Carter said, offering a small smile. "And I'll be watching. I expect results." Ms. Riley nodded, looking more confident now. "You'll get them, Mr. Carter." Mr. Carter left the bank that day feeling more hopeful than he had in days. He wasn't just another customer, and he wasn't going to let anyone forget that. The change had begun, and he would be there every step of the way to make sure it lasted. The days following Mr. Carter's return to the bank were filled with change, and it seemed like the employees were starting to learn from their mistakes. While the atmosphere at the branch was still a bit tense, there was a noticeable shift. Staff members were more polite, more eager to assist customers, and more willing to go the extra mile. It was clear that they understood something important had changed, not just for Mr. Carter, but for the way they viewed everyone who walked through their doors. But even as the staff began to adjust, Mr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something more needed to be done. He wasn't just a customer who deserved better treatment. He was a person who had been unfairly judged simply because of his appearance. It was clear that the problem went deeper than just this one incident. One afternoon, Mr. Carter received a call from Claire, the customer service representative who had stood by him. Her voice was friendly, but serious as she spoke. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to update you on the situation. The corporate team has reviewed everything, and we're taking your concerns seriously. We've decided to implement some new policies for diversity and inclusion training at all of our branches, starting with this one." Mr. Carter listened carefully. He appreciated the effort, but he knew that policies weren't enough on their own. Change needed to come from within, from the hearts and minds of the people who worked there. "That's good to hear," Mr. Carter said, his voice calm but firm. "But the real test is how the staff treats every customer, not just the ones who hold power or who look important." Claire hesitated before speaking again. "You're absolutely right. We'll also be holding regular meetings with the staff to ensure they understand the importance of respect and equality. We want to create an environment where everyone feels valued, no matter their background." Mr. Carter thought about this for a moment. He wanted to believe that the bank was committed to making a real change, but he also knew that this wasn't just about one bank. It was about making sure people everywhere understood the value of treating each other with dignity, no matter who they were. "I'll be keeping an eye on things," Mr. Carter said, his voice steady. "This is only the beginning. I want to see more than just empty words. I want to see action." Claire assured him that the bank was serious about making lasting improvements, and they promised to stay in touch with him as they worked through the new changes. That evening, as Mr. Carter sat in his quiet home, he reflected on everything that had happened. It had started as a frustrating and painful experience, but now it felt like a turning point. The treatment he had endured had sparked something bigger, something that could make a real difference in how people were treated, not just at this bank, but in other places as well. He knew there was still work to be done, but he was encouraged by the fact that his efforts were starting to pay off. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. Hope that things could change, hope that respect could become the standard, and hope that his actions could inspire others to stand up for what was right. Mr. Carter smiled to himself as he thought about the future. He had made a difference, and he wasn't done yet. A few days later, Mr. Carter returned to the bank, determined to see how much had truly changed. He had been promised that things were different, that the atmosphere was more respectful and welcoming. Today, he was going to find out if those promises had been kept. As he walked through the doors, he immediately noticed something was different. The tellers greeted him with warm smiles, and there was an air of professionalism that had been lacking before. The staff seemed more attentive, more ready to help. It was a good sign, but Mr. Carter knew that the true test would come with how they responded to him, not just as a customer, but as a person. He made his way to the counter, where a familiar face greeted him. It was the young teller who had been so dismissive when he first walked in. Her smile was genuine now, but Mr. Carter couldn't help but wonder if she truly understood the importance of treating people with respect. "Good morning, sir," she said, her tone much friendlier than before. "How can I assist you today?" "I'd like to speak with the manager," Mr. Carter said, his voice calm but firm. He wanted to make sure the changes were real, and he was prepared to hold everyone accountable. The teller hesitated for a moment, but quickly went to the back office to fetch Ms. Riley. A few minutes later, the manager appeared, looking more composed than Mr. Carter had seen her before. She smiled politely, but there was a slight nervousness in her demeanor. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Ms. Riley said. "How can I help you today?" "I wanted to check in," Mr. Carter began, his tone even. "You said you were going to make some changes, and I wanted to see how things were going. I've been hearing good things, but I wanted to see for myself." Ms. Riley nodded, looking relieved that he wasn't upset. "I'm glad to hear that. We've been working hard to implement the changes we discussed. We've started diversity training, and we've been having regular meetings with the staff to ensure that everyone understands the importance of treating all customers with respect." Mr. Carter listened carefully. He appreciated her efforts, but he also knew that words were only part of the equation. He needed to see the real change in action, not just hear about it. "You say things are changing, but the real test is in the details," Mr. Carter said. "How are you making sure that these changes stick? How are you ensuring that your staff is actually putting these values into practice?" Ms. Riley seemed to consider his words for a moment. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Carter. But I understand that it's not enough to simply train the staff. It's about creating a culture of respect and understanding. We're making sure that everyone, from the tellers to the managers, understands what that looks like every day." Mr. Carter nodded slowly. "That's a start, but it's not just about making promises. It's about following through. It's about changing the way people think, not just what they say." The conversation felt different than it had before. There was no defensiveness in Ms. Riley's tone, no dismissiveness. She seemed genuinely invested in making things right. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Carter," she said. "And I agree. We have a lot of work to do. But I promise you, we're committed to making this the kind of bank that treats everyone fairly and with respect." Mr. Carter stood for a moment, considering her words. He didn't need grand gestures, just a sincere commitment to change. He could tell that Ms. Riley was trying, and that was all he needed to see. "I'll be watching," Mr. Carter said, offering a small smile. "But I believe in second chances. I'll give you that." As he left the bank that day, Mr. Carter felt a sense of satisfaction. He wasn't just a customer anymore. He had become a catalyst for change, and while there was still more work to be done, he knew that he had made a difference. The journey wasn't over, but today he had seen progress, and that was enough for now. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Carter watched carefully as the bank made changes. He noticed the staff seemed more polite, more attentive, and there was a general sense of professionalism in the air. It wasn't perfect yet, but the improvements were noticeable, and that gave him hope. He could see that the bank was taking his concerns seriously. One morning, as Mr. Carter sat in his favorite coffee shop, he received an unexpected call. It was from the bank's corporate office, and he was immediately intrigued. He picked up the phone, ready to listen. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end said. "This is Linda, from the bank's corporate office. I'm calling to personally apologize for the treatment you received at our branch. We take this matter very seriously, and I wanted to speak with you about what we've done to address it." Mr. Carter was quiet for a moment. He had been expecting this call ever since the changes had begun. He appreciated that the bank was taking the time to reach out, but he wanted to hear the details. "I'm listening," he said, keeping his tone calm. "First of all," Linda continued, "I want to apologize for the disrespectful way you were treated. That is not the standard of service we expect from our employees, and we have taken immediate steps to address it. We've implemented new training programs focused on diversity, inclusion, and customer respect. All of our staff will be required to complete this training by the end of the month." Mr. Carter nodded, feeling a sense of relief. This was a good start. "I appreciate that. But words are only the beginning. What else are you doing to ensure that this doesn't happen again?" Linda responded quickly. "We've also set up a system for customers to provide feedback directly to the corporate office. If anyone feels they've been treated unfairly, we'll be able to address it immediately. We're committed to creating a culture where everyone, no matter who they are, feels valued." Mr. Carter felt a slight sense of pride as he listened to Linda. He had pushed for change, and now it seemed like his efforts were making a real difference. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "It's important to hold people accountable, but it's just as important to make sure we're treating each other with respect every day." Linda agreed. "Exactly. And I want to assure you that we're doing everything we can to make lasting improvements. We've also reached out to our branch managers to let them know about the changes we've made. Ms. Riley, the manager at the branch you visited, has already spoken to her team about the importance of fair treatment for all customers." Mr. Carter smiled, feeling like his voice had been heard. "I appreciate that. I know change doesn't happen overnight, but it sounds like you're on the right track." "We are, Mr. Carter, and we truly value your feedback. We'll continue to monitor progress and ensure that the staff maintains the standards we're working toward. You've been a key part of helping us see what needs to be done." Mr. Carter paused for a moment, reflecting on how far things had come. He had gone from feeling disrespected to being part of a movement for change. He could see that the bank was genuinely trying to improve, and that made him feel like his efforts hadn't been in vain. "I'm glad I could help," Mr. Carter said, "and I'll be keeping an eye on things. I want to make sure the changes stick." Linda thanked him again and assured him that they would continue working hard to improve. As he hung up the phone, Mr. Carter felt a quiet satisfaction. He had faced a difficult situation, but instead of letting it break him, he had used it as an opportunity to make things better for everyone. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure everyone, no matter their background, was treated with the respect they deserved. And that, Mr. Carter realized, was the true victory. A few weeks after the call from corporate, Mr. Carter returned to the bank, curious to see how much had truly changed. The improvements he had heard about seemed promising, but he knew that real change could only be measured by actions, not just words. Today, he was going to see if the bank's new policies and training programs had made a real difference. As he entered the bank, he noticed a distinct difference in the atmosphere. The staff greeted him with genuine smiles, their demeanor polite and respectful. There was a sense of professionalism in the air that had been missing before, and it felt like the bank had undergone a transformation. Mr. Carter approached the counter, where a new teller was standing. She was young, with bright eyes and a friendly smile. "Good morning, sir," she said warmly. "How can I assist you today?" Mr. Carter smiled back, his heart lightening. "Good morning. I'd like to make a deposit." The teller quickly and efficiently completed his transaction, all while maintaining a respectful and attentive attitude. Mr. Carter could tell that she wasn't just going through the motions, she genuinely cared about providing good service. As he finished his business at the counter, he saw Ms. Riley, the branch manager, walking toward him. She had a more confident and relaxed air than he had seen before. There was no tension, no defensiveness in her expression. She looked like a woman who had learned from her mistakes and was ready to make things right. "Mr. Carter," Ms. Riley said with a warm smile, "it's good to see you again. I wanted to thank you personally for helping us realize what needed to be done. We've come a long way, and it's all because of your willingness to speak up." Mr. Carter nodded, feeling a sense of pride in what had been accomplished. "It's not just about me. It's about making sure this is a place where everyone feels valued, no matter who they are." Ms. Riley agreed. "You're absolutely right. We've implemented several new policies, but the real change has to come from within. We're working hard to make sure that respect and fairness are at the core of everything we do here." Mr. Carter could see the sincerity in her eyes, and he knew that this wasn't just empty talk. The changes were real, and the bank was on the right path. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, not just for the bank, but for him as well. As he left the bank, Mr. Carter couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. A few weeks ago, he had been dismissed, ignored, and humiliated. But now he was leaving the bank with his head held high, knowing that his actions had made a difference. He had faced adversity, but instead of letting it break him, he had used it as an opportunity to stand up for what was right. His efforts had sparked change, and that change was making the bank a better place for everyone. Mr. Carter smiled to himself as he walked down the street. He knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more battles to fight. But for now, he was content. He had seen real progress, and he had played a part in making it happen. As he disappeared into the crowd, it was clear that Mr. Carter had not just been a customer at that bank. He had become a symbol of the power of standing up for what is right, no matter the obstacles in your way.